Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking what feels like a shortcut, really, into understanding the very first moves of the North African campaign, the legendary one. We often picture it starting and ending with, the desert fox himself, Erwin Rommel, but we're digging into something different today, using the unique viewpoint of his aide-de-camp, H.W. Schmidt. It's all from his amazing eyewitness account, with Rommel in the desert. So our mission, if you like, is to look beyond those famous tank battles, Tobruk and all that, and hunt for the hidden story, the context, specifically that crucial early conflict that really set the stage for Rommel's whole operation, maybe even before he landed in Tripoli. And we're really going to zero in on the vital, sort of foundational role played by Eritrea, how it shaped those first really tight months of the Desert War.
That's absolutely the crucial pivot point. Rommel shows up in early 1941, right? Tasked with basically rescuing the Italian position in Libya. But the sources we have, Schmidt's included, they make it clear his arrival wasn't into some kind of strategic vacuum. Not at all. The campaign's potential, its limitations, they were already being shaped, maybe even decided, thousands of miles away to the east. Rommel's initial supply problems, and just as important, the Allies' early intelligence advantage. These were direct results of the British campaign that was, at that very moment, successfully seizing Italian East Africa.
Okay, right. So let's unpack Schmidt's personal story then, because it gives us this perfect, almost tangible link between these two fronts, doesn't it? He was a lieutenant, just appointed to Rommel's staff. And when he gets his special orders, his papers actually make him think he's heading for the East African front, way off in Eritrea, a front everyone knew was collapsing.
Exactly. He's packing his bags, essentially, preparing to join a unit in what was clearly a losing theater. It really shows how fragmented, maybe, Germany's strategic thinking was in late 40, early 41. Personnel were first being sent to try and, shore up the Italian collapse in the Horn of Africa, not yet focused on launching a big new offensive way over in North Africa.
And this is where Schmidt's experience becomes, well, essential history, you could say. That first really valuable piece of British intelligence, the sort of smoking gun confirming Rommel's arrival in North Africa with troops. That document, it was captured by the Allies during their really fierce fighting for Keren in Eritrea.
And this is way more than just some random captured paper. It directly ties that whole strategic Eastern theater, East Africa, straight into the Western desert, Keren. It was this critical mountain pass. A real choke point, probably the toughest battle of the whole East African campaign, many say. So when the British forces, including troops from India, took Keren, they didn't just win a battle. They grabbed concrete proof the Axis were sending a proper expeditionary force in Tripoli. The Allies knew Rommel was coming almost as soon as he arrived because of that Axis defeat happening way over in the Horn of Africa.
And Schmidt himself, he sort of lives this frantic switch. He describes his own escape, literally, from that closing Eastern front. He avoids being captured near Asmara, manages to get passage on a desperate Italian plane out, and finally lands in Tripoli. And what's the first thing that happens? Staff officers question him. You come from Eritrea, Lieutenant.
Yeah. It confirms that the collapsing Eastern Front was essentially being scavenged for experienced men. Survivors were being rerouted directly into this new North African fight.
And it wasn't just Schmidt, right? There was an actual German unit there.
That's right. The sources mentioned the specific unit he was initially meant to join, the General Voluntary Motorized Company, a German detachment actually stationed in Eritrea. It shows Berlin had this sort of adaptive, maybe opportunistic footprint in that region before the Afrika Korps was even a thing. But the failure of that early presence, well, it had huge consequences.
Okay, so let's connect that failure to the bigger strategic picture. The battles in Eritrea and East Africa weren't just some sideshow then. They were really about supply lines.
Fundamentally about supply lines, yes. And those dictated Rommel's constraints right from the start.
It was about logistics, but maybe also about time and security for those lines.
Exactly, time and security. The British campaign there moved quickly. You had forces like Brigadier Dan Pienaar's South Africans advancing on Italian Somalia and Abyssinia. Their success bought the Allies time to secure those crucial sea lanes, especially in the Red Sea. Time and control that Rommel basically never got back.
Schmidt later writes about this incredibly revealing chat he had with General Paulus, the one who later surrendered at Stalingrad. And Paulus lays out the logistical plan, or what should have been the plan. German and Italian ships were meant to be delivering vital war supplies to the Red Sea port of Massawa in Eritrea.
Massawa was intended as a secure primary supply hub for Axis operations in Africa. Think about it.
Why Massawa specifically? Why not just stick to Tripoli?
Well, think about the geography. The supply lines from Italy across the Mediterranean to Tripoli. They were long, they were slow, And quickly, they were under constant attack. Allied planes, submarines, surface ships. The Med was dangerous. A secure port like Massawa on the Red Sea, that could potentially access supplies coming up from the Indian Ocean, maybe bypass the worst of the Med blockade. It was meant to be a safer, maybe even faster alternative.
It just didn't happen.
It was cut off almost immediately. As soon as the British gained control of the approaches to Eritrea, the sources mentioned specific ships like the Coburg.
The Coburg. What was significant about that one?
It was carrying, get this, 9,000 tons of war material. 9,000 tons. It was intercepted, captured by the Royal Navy, gone. And that loss, the loss of that whole Red Sea supply route through Massawa, it was a direct result of the collapse in East Africa. A massive strategic blow right off the bat.
Wow. So Rommel arrives, and one of his main intended supply lines is already dead in the water.
Precisely. It meant his force, the Afrika Korps, just starting to arrive,
Yeah.
had to rely completely on that limited, dangerous, often choked Mediterranean route to Tripoli. This wasn't just, an inconvenience. It strangled the flow of German supplies before the Desert Fox could even properly begin. His famous early dashes, they were characterized by making do with very little right from day one. And the reason for that scarcity leads straight back to Eritrea and Massawa.
And Schmidt throws in these little human details too, doesn't he? Amidst all the strategy, he remembers being on leave later and hearing stories from a friend's Italian wife about the, quote, beautiful women living in the hotel in Asmara. It's just a tiny anecdote, but it kind of reminds you that this place he just fled, Eritrea, its capital Asmara. It was a real place, a functioning zone, before the strategic hammer fell.
Yeah, it contrasts that memory of maybe relative normalcy against the huge geopolitical shift that was happening, a shift that would directly shape the Desert War.
So that contrast really brings up the main question, doesn't it? How did that quick, decisive end to the East African campaign, particularly the fall of the Eritrean front, how did that directly shape how Rommel had to fight in Libya and Egypt?
Fundamentally, it shaped everything.
When Rommel first got there, Schmidt notes he was basically an unknown figure and no hero then. His first actions in Tripoli, pushing forward quickly, they were driven by, well, necessity, right? Trying to stabilize the retreating Italians, not because he had overwhelming strength.
Not at all. He inherited chronic supply problems from the moment he stepped off the plane.
Okay.
And that links straight back to Massawa being lost. The sources are very clear. The 5th Light Division, one of Rommel's key armored units, arrived severely under strength. They were desperate for tanks, for spares, for everything.
And the loss of the Red Sea route just made it worse.
Exponentially worse. It forced total reliance on that fragile Mediterranean supply line. It simply wasn't enough to properly equip and sustain a modern, fast-moving, mechanized force like Rommel wanted to build.
Then you see that scarcity dictating tactics.
Absolutely. He had to improvise constantly, make do with what little he had. The classic example, mentioned in the source, is the early use of the 88mm anti-aircraft gun against tanks.
It's the famous 88.
The famous 88.
Oh,
But why were they using a heavy flak gun against tanks? Because they didn't have enough proper anti-tank guns. They were forced to use it in that role. It was heavy, awkward to deploy against ground targets. It wasn't ideal.
So it wasn't initial genius, but desperation.
Initially, yes, it was a sign of that logistical deficit. Rommel was forced into these kinds of improvisations because the specialized equipment he should have received, perhaps through that safer Massawa route, the stuff that was maybe on the Coburg or ships like it, it just never got there, thanks to the British victory in Eritrea.
It's really quite incredible how Schmidt's account just pulls back the curtain. It shows us the Desert War didn't really kick off in the sands of Libya. Its initial conditions, its constraints, were set by a logistical and intelligence defeat thousands of miles away in East Africa. Schmidt's own chaotic journey, that crucial document captured at Keren. It all points to the fact that the Afrika Korps' fate was tied right from the start to that British campaign in Eritrea and losing the port of Massawa.
The sources make it absolutely undeniable. The flow, or lack thereof, of supplies, and that critical early intelligence gained by the Allies. It all originated from the battles fought on the Eritrean front. Knowing who was coming, what forces Rommel had initially, that Allied knowledge came from Keren. And the material access losses, like those 9,000 tons on the Coburg because Massawa fell. These factors profoundly shaped everything the Desert Fox did next. The Desert War really began for the Axis on the back foot because of that earlier, often overlooked, defeat in East Africa, specifically Eritrea.
It just puts a completely new spin on the whole thing, doesn't it? It transforms the Desert War from just this tactical slugfest in North Africa into part of much bigger continental logistical struggle, a struggle whose opening rounds were dictated by the failure to hold Eritrea. So here's our final thought for you to chew on. Our provocative question. What if? What if the British campaign in Eritrea had stalled? If it had gotten bogged down, maybe like Gallipoli in the First World War. Imagine if Massawa had remained a functioning, secure access supply port on the Red Sea, maybe even getting supplies shipped easily across the Indian Ocean. How much sooner might the Afrika Korps have been fully equipped, fully fueled, and how different, how much more dangerous could Rommel's legendary but famously supply-starved desert campaign have been?
That's the real strategic what-if stemming from those battles in the Horn of Africa. It's something to think about.